Well, thank you, Gudrun, for that very, very generous introduction. I have to live up to it now. I can't say how happy I am to be back at Dumbarton Oaks. We had an ARIA meeting here, and we've had tours of the gardens, and I was here for a mid-semester course about a year and a half ago, I think. And it's just always a pleasure to be in this room and wander around this beautiful house. I won't be talking much about Washington collections today, so you'll have to look forward to tomorrow for that. But hopefully this presentation will give you a little bit of context on which to hang the great achievements of the private collectors as they founded Washington museums. All right. Henry James observed that to be an American is, quote, an excellent preparation for culture, pointing to the range of qualities that include Americans' long tradition of private collecting coupled with public philanthropy that has extended over centuries, far outdistancing our English and European exemplars. By no means all who have supported the arts have been collectors, but a great number have been, and it is those collectors who will be my focus this evening, as I aim to give you some background for the more in-depth examinations of Washington art collecting and public institutions that we will enjoy hearing about tomorrow. A common thread that will weave through my presentation is at the heart of James's letter, penned early in his life in 1867 to Thomas Sargent Perry, as he underscores our American tendency openly to embrace the cultures of others, to shape them into something new in our New World context, generally with a concern for educating our fellow citizens being paramount. James wrote more fully, "We young Americans are men of the future. I feel that my only chance for success as a critic is to let all of the breezes of the West blow through me at their will. I think that to be an American is an excellent preparation for culture. We have exquisite qualities as a race, and it seems to me that we are ahead of the European races in the fact that we can deal freely with forms of civilization not our own, can pick and choose and assimilate, and in short, claim our property wherever we find it. To have no national stamp has hitherto been a defect and a drawback, but I think it not unlikely that American writers may yet indicate that a vast intellectual fusion and synthesis of the various national tendencies of the world is the condition of more important achievements than any we have seen," unquote. And as we look around the museums of our nation's capital here, that together constitute an exciting range of synthesis of cultures from Asian art at the Freer to the various Smithsonian museums displaying Native American and Western art, we can appreciate James's observation all the more. So how did this come about, and when did the coupling of art collecting and public-spirited philanthropy gain traction in our country? The founding fathers were actually pretty miserable in this regard, as all seemed more preoccupied with matters of state, or in Benjamin Franklin's case, perhaps scientific invention. The one exception was Thomas Jefferson, who did have a modest art collection, mostly copies, and made a wish list of pictures he would hope to own. The closest anyone came in their generation to establishing a museum was the artist and naturalist Charles Willson Peale, who, like many artists, opened a gallery to exhibit his paintings with the hope of enticing new clients to show an interest to commission portraits and buy still lifes. As it turned out, though, the public was interested above all in the specimens of bones and rocks and stuffed animals that he collected for his still lifes in a way. So his Peale Museum, first located in Philadelphia and later in Baltimore, became the nation's first showplace for natural history. Eventually, though, it failed, in part because Peale could not obtain government support for the enterprise. But it established a norm, also for failing to get government support, for collectors to look beyond themselves to educate and please the public. Despite that lack of support forthcoming from the government, or maybe because of it, we can trace several attempts during the antebellum years when collectors of note strove to bring art to the public. Most notable among these cultural leaders of the early republic was Robert Gilmore Jr. of Baltimore, whose highly sophisticated taste was influenced by his travels to Europe and his knowledge of the patterns of collecting and display that were practiced by his English counterparts. The son of a wealthy merchant for whom doors would open to any aristocratic or merchant banker's collection, Gilmore took the equivalent of the Grand Tour in 1800 and came to know Europe's great public galleries on the continent. He called the Louvre his academy, and his principal advisor was the first director of the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam. He knew well the private art collections formed by the banking family of Sir Francis Baring and Thomas and Henry Hope's collections, as well as that of the Earl of Stafford. These last two collections were displayed in grand London mansions. Here we have the Barings, the Hope brothers, and one of the pictures that they own now in the Villa Borghese. But the Stafford and Hope collections opened in 1804 and 1808, respectively, on occasion for artists and members of the public to enjoy. Here we are. This is the Stafford collection. Bear in mind now that England had no national gallery at that time either. It was founded in 1824. So artists and the public had to rely on these collections and even more on the British institution to educate themselves about art. Back in Baltimore now, Gilmore built a home that he himself designed as a stylistic nod to Horace Walpole's Strawberry Hill, and he filled it with treasures that reflected the same range of tastes for classical, Italian, Dutch, and English art that his friends, the Hopes and the Barings, had embraced. And in addition, he displayed masterpieces by contemporary artists such as Thomas Cole, with whom he maintained a lively correspondence throughout their lives. Like his English counterparts, Gilmore opened his collection for public viewing and aspired to have the Smithsonian acquire the collection as the core of a national art museum. But his dream, like Peale's, failed and the collection was dispersed. On learning of Gilmore's death in 1848, his fellow collector, Philip Hone, a mayor of New York, recorded in his diary his view of his, quote, much loved and valued friend, an enlightened liberal and honorable merchant, a person of excellent taste, a connoisseur and lover of art. He possessed one of the best private collections of pictures in the country, which, with a fine library, cabinet of medals, collection of autographs, and other rarities, made his house in Baltimore a rich and valuable museum of works of art. His intellectual acquirements were of a highly respectable character, unquote. The efforts of men such as Peale and Gilmore typify the behavior of many mid-19th century collectors who strove to bring art to the public. But with the single exception of Daniel Wadsworth, none was successful until the Gilded Age, and all had to depend on their personal resources to give shape to their aspirations. As a member of one of the wealthiest families in Hartford, Connecticut, Daniel Wadsworth, an exact contemporary of Gilmore, had ample resources to establish his Athenaeum in the family home in 1842, making it the oldest museum in our country. Strictly speaking, as an Athenaeum, this is defined as broadly dedicated to bringing culture to the people. It was more than a fine art museum alone that the Wadsworth is today, though it still retains the Athenaeum appellation. Because it was not only paintings and sculpture, mostly donated by members of the Wadsworth family, it also had books and historical artifacts that later had to be transferred to the Hartford Public Library and the Connecticut Historical Society. Among collectors of the next generation, born between 1800 and 1820, two other collectors bear mentioning because of their efforts to bring their collections to the public. These are Thomas Jefferson Bryan and James Jackson Jarvis. In both cases, like Gilmore, their formative years were spent in Europe, travel always being a stimulant to art collecting that should never, ever be underestimated. And they also both hoped that their legacies would be to establish the nucleus of a national gallery. A wealthy Philadelphian, Bryan built most of his art collection during nearly 30 years that he spent abroad. Based in Paris, but making frequent trips to Italy, often attending auctions, reading widely in the art and critical literature of the day, and advised by art cognoscenti such as Alexis François Artaud de Montour, who was the diplomat and French chargé d'affaires in Florence in the Napoleonic years, Bryan gained a reputation for having a discerning eye for quality in the art he so avidly collected. We'll see. Bryan purchased heavily in Paris at the auction of Montour's collection, and those pictures, together with the ones he had acquired from other sources, including ones in Italy, amounted to a total of nearly 250 pictures by more than 150 artists that came back to America with him to be displayed starting in 1852 at, quote, Bryan's Gallery of Christian Art, really Western art, not Christian art, that opened on Broadway and 13th Street in New York. The mission of Bryan's gallery was to illustrate, the, quote, rise and progress of each of the great national schools, Italian, German, Flemish, Dutch, and French, unquote. Artists were admitted free of charge, as was often the case in England, too. The general public paid 25 cents. A companion book written by Richard Grant White, who is coincidentally the father of Stanford White, was published and described the characteristics of each national school, while acknowledging that Bryan's gallery offered, quote, pictures of little intrinsic beauty or merit, which yet have great value and interest, for they mark the transition from one style to another, or they mark a particular phase in the life of the individual painter, or they illustrate a certain aspect of faith, of civilization, of morals in the country which produced them, unquote. Henry James was a good deal more harsh in his assessment of Bryan's collection, calling it one, quote, of worm-eaten diptychs and triptychs, of angular saints and seraphs, of black Madonnas and obscure bambinos, of such marked and approved primitives as has never yet been shipped to our shores, unquote. Alas, the Bryan Gallery, or maybe not alas, was short-lived for lack of greater financial support, sounding familiar, than Bryan was able to muster, and his executors worked out an arrangement for his collection to go to the New York Historical Society, where it remained until the late 70s, 80s, and finally the 90s, when when the auctions were held, divesting the Historical Society of the collection. The best of the pieces went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, such as this glorious Desco de Parto or Birth Salver that was Lorenzo de' Medici's The Magnificence by Giovanni di Ser Giovanni. The author and collector James Jackson Jarvis, and I apologize for this dingy picture, it seems to be the only one that exists showing his gallery, Jarvis was also an expat for most of his life, first as a journalist in Hawaii, and later settling down with roots in Florence among the Brownings and the other Anglo-American kindred spirit expats. He wrote extensively on art, and his essay titled A Lesson for Merchant Princes is telling. He writes, quote, if we are to build up on American soil cities like Florence, world-renowned for art and science, even more than for commerce and luxury, we must heed merchant princes cultured like Rucellai and deeply imbued with his maxim that it is pleasanter and more honorable to spend money for wise purposes than to make it. Rucellai is not the highest type of man and citizen, but there is in him a public spirit which may be studied to advantage by many of our merchant princes, whose fortunes are far superior to his self-made one, as America is a land of greater diversity of gifts and promise than ever was Italy, unquote. Jarvis was undeniably a compulsive collector, so much so that after going bankrupt due to overzealous buying once, he formed a second collection that also got him in financial trouble. All the same, he hoped to jumpstart a national collection with his own. But in the end, because of his shaky finances, he entered into a rather complex loan agreement with Yale University with the collection as collateral. So, no surprise, the bulk of that first collection he formed ultimately ended up at Yale, and these are some of the pictures it held. They're really quite glorious. The second collection, just parenthetically, went to Cleveland because it was sold to someone named Liberty Holden, whose widow bequeathed it to the Cleveland Art Museum. So, thus far in our history, the what's mine is yours motivation appears to be keenly felt among noteworthy American collectors, but with the exception of Wadsworth, their attempts to edify the public through the establishment of lasting institutions for the display of art that they collected had failed. Everything changes with the Gilded Age, when industrialization led to new prosperity, bringing with it unprecedented opportunities to adorn and embellish both private homes and public institutions. This was a time when Americans traveled abroad more than ever, visiting artist studios, you see Bouguereau's at the top left there, and hosting world fairs on their own shores, becoming citizens of the world, engaged with and curious about the cultures of others, as Henry James had observed. Thus, with wealth, curiosity, and that peculiarly American civic-minded drive to educate and please their fellow citizens, the cultural leaders of the Gilded Age embraced the opportunities that came their way, with art pouring out of cash-poor Europe, British and European collections especially, the aristocratic houses especially, to amass great art collections of their own, many of which would ultimately form the bedrock of our country's great museums. Although the pace of art collecting ramped up all across the United States during the post-Civil War era, New York was undoubtedly the epicenter of the art market and boasted the greatest number of private art collections and art associations during that period. At first, collectors such as William Henry Vanderbilt followed the pattern of earlier generations, opening the galleries in their homes to the public on specific days, or alternatively, they offered their collections up for public viewing through the American Art Association, as Thomas B. Clark did in 1883. But eventually, the dearth of public museums in any of our leading cities came to be viewed as something akin to dereliction of duty on the part of artists and civic leaders. The case of the founding of the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a classic one, and that I will recount for you now. But the founding of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston during the same year, 1870, and 4 years later, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, 6 years later, are similarly momentous. In the case of the Met, one of the only municipal museums I know of that was founded with absolutely no art collection whatsoever, civic-minded reformers from many walks of life, artists, architects, writers, lawyers, and collectors got together at the Union League Club to hatch the plan that came to fruition with the founding in April of 1870 of a museum, quote, to be located in the city of New York for the purpose of establishing and maintaining in said city a museum and library of art, of encouraging and developing the study of the fine arts and the application of arts to manufacture and practical life, of advancing the general knowledge of kindred subjects, and to that end of furnishing popular instruction, unquote. At first situated at 681 Fifth Avenue, near where MoMA is today, and for a brief period on West 14th Street, the museum took up its permanent location in Central Park in 1880. On that occasion, Joseph C. Choate, a great orator of his day, delivered the principal address, and among other observations noted that the museum's founders, quote, believed that the diffusion of a knowledge of art in its highest forms of beauty would tend directly to humanize, to educate, and refine a practical and laborious people. That though the great masterpieces of painting and sculpture could never be within their reach, were they ever wrong, yet it might be possible in the progress of time to gather together a collection of works of merit, which should impart some knowledge of art and its history to a people who were yet to take almost their first steps in that department of knowledge, unquote. So the educational role of the museum was clear from the very start, as was its aim to be encyclopedic in its collecting scope, as one of the planning group at the Union League, George Fiscomfort, had expressed when he said, quote, "A great museum, one worthy of New York City and of our country, should represent the history of art in all countries, in all ages, of art both pure and applied," unquote. So what did they do about acquiring art? Now that we get to this. The collections were jump-started by the so-called 1871 purchase of 174 paintings, largely bought in Paris and Brussels by the museum's vice president, William T. Blodgett, a collector himself and a savvy negotiator who took full advantage of the availability of fine art, mostly contemporary, well, not all contemporary, that was emerging from private collections during the Franco-Prussian War. So with this purchase, well, this is always the case with art collecting. One man's loss is another man's gain. So with this purchase, the museum was on its way, attracting large crowds, as you see, and paying members as well. Most importantly, taking its place as a meaningful repository for private art collections to be bequeathed, such as that of Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, the only woman to serve on the Met's founding board of trustees. Wolfe's taste in art was typical of her generation, largely focusing on contemporary art exhibited and sold at the Paris Salons and London's Royal Academy. And many of the pictures that she bequeathed to the Met have been deaccessioned as they weaned themselves of the vast numbers of that kind of painting that they owned. At least that's what I think. And they certainly no longer hang together in the Catherine Lorillard Wolfe galleries that are no longer extant, but that she had prescribed that they should be together in her will. But her legacy to the collections of the museum is robust all the same, because Wolfe not only donated paintings from her personal collection that you see here, but she also provided funds for future acquisitions, making possible purchases of some of the Met's greatest masterpieces. Wolfe was by no means unique in this regard. Among Met board members supporting museum acquisitions was also Henry Marquand, who had been one of the founding group at the Union League Club that set the mission of the museum with the charge to, quote, humanize, to educate, and to refine that practical and laborious people. And he became the institution's second president and spent much energy on building the museum's collection. During his lifetime, he was justly hailed as, quote, the greatest collector in America, because he collects not for himself alone, but for a whole people and for all the world, unquote. As he acquired for the museum and donated from his own collection 50 old master paintings, as well as dozens of objects, and through the Marquand Fund made possible continuing acquisitions of masterpieces, he's rightly known as one of the museum's greatest founding fathers. Thus, the trustees of the Met subscribed both to the dictum of what's mine is yours and to the purely philanthropical notion of giving financial support to the museum's collections through the establishment of acquisitions funds. By contrast, they come in both kinds, though, because by contrast to Marquand, for example, was the department store mogul. Oh, wait a minute. Sorry, backing up here. I'm in the wrong place here. Benjamin Altman, because having bequeathed his collection to the museum with many strings attached, he apparently had no interest in supporting future acquisitions. There was a lot of toing and froing in the negotiations, to the point that Altman required that the pictures should always hang proximate to one another, as they do to this day. He was more persuasive than Catherine Lorillard Wolfe, evidently, and never to be loaned to other museums, or else he, Altman, would yank the intended donation and establish his own personal museum instead. The polar opposite of Altman, was Jacob S. Rogers, who was the president of Rogers Locomotive Works in Paterson, New Jersey. He was not well known to the museum and probably wasn't even an art collector. So he actually has no real place in my talk this evening. Yet what he did for the Met was so exceptional that it does bear mentioning. Rogers gave gave $10 a year for a membership in the museum. He may never have visited the galleries, but he visited the director's office often. He never met with the board, but he did gather information from the director, Luigi Palma di Cesnola, about the board's level of involvement with the collection and the museum's governance. And yet, after this quasi-anonymous interest in the museum, he provided capital for the Rogers Fund with his will that has made possible literally thousands of extraordinary acquisitions over the decades. Completely unexpected, the director learned about the bequest through the newspapers. It amounted to more than $5 million and an additional $1 million in real estate assets that would be close to a total of $200 million in today's money. So the last of the many collectors of the Gilded Age who played a key role in the augmenting of the Met's collections that I'll highlight this evening are Henry and Louisine Havemeyer. Like Marquand, they acquired pictures for the museum, as well as donating works from their personal collection, as they distinguished themselves by their taste for what was then absolutely cutting-edge art, often bought on the advice of their good friend Mary Cassatt. Whether that be El Greco or Goya, both regarded as very avant-garde or edgy in their day, much more so than Rembrandt and Van Dyck anyway, or whether it was the Impressionists. Now, among Gilded Age collectors, J. Pierpont Morgan stood above all others as an omnivorous collector, a great benefactor, having amassed the largest art collection of the time, and having supported both the Met as its president and establishing the Morgan Library. Today, we are probably less aware of the sheer quantity of objects in the Morgan collection because it was more than 4,000 than his contemporaries were, because after his death, the entire collection was exhibited at the Metropolitan Museum for more than a year, so they were aware of it. But then after the exhibit closed, the collection was broken up, much of it going to the Met to join works that Morgan had purchased specifically for the museum, such as Raphael's Colonna Madonna in the upper right there, while other objects like the Stavelot triptych at the lower center went to the Morgan Library, and still there was plenty left for the likes of Henry Clay Frick and other family members to inherit. Frick bought all of these pieces from the Morgan collection. With the founding of the Morgan Library as a personal collection museum with license to grow all the same, we're back in the realm of Daniel Wadsworth in a certain way. One of the first attempts at this, though, before Morgan, but after Wadsworth, first following the Vanderbilt model, was Baltimore millionaire William Walter's tradition of opening his home to the collection to visitors every Wednesday in April, charging 50 cents admission fee, which he donated to the Baltimore Association for the Improvement in the Condition of the Poor. Walters was raised, by the way, with a very keen awareness of moral purpose and remarked at one time to a friend, quote, "To surround your family with forms of material beauty and loveliness, with illustrations of virtue and noble deeds, with admonitions of duty and affection, is to impress them that there is a literature of art by no means second to that of letters in importance of teachings." Unquote. These public openings became an annual event by 1878 and were eagerly anticipated by Baltimore's residents. You can see how he hung his pictures in the typical way of the time, salon style, just cheek by jowl. William's heir, Henry, continued his father's tradition in the sense of service to the citizens of Baltimore, and even though he lived mainly in New York and was a trustee of the Metropolitan Museum, he added quantities of new works to the Baltimore collection, especially old masters, bronzes, Limoges enamels, and eventually transformed 3 townhouses that he had purchased in 1900 into a public museum, the Walters Art Gallery of Baltimore, that I'm sure all of you are very familiar, that opened in 1909. Now, as personal collections museums proliferated during the Gilded Age, starting with Isabella Stewart Gardner's Fenway Court, the personal collection museum concept came more and more to be understood as a reflection of the high social standing, personality, and taste of the founder, even in cases like the Frick collection that didn't enshrine the collection but rather provided for growth. As Morgan had been seen as an American Medici, this is the Morgan Library here, interior, emulating the taste of Renaissance Rome for the interior decor of his library, Isabella Stewart Gardner was encouraged by her principal advisor, Bernard Berenson, pictured on the right, to see herself as the reincarnation of the greatest woman collector and art patron of Renaissance Italy, Isabella d'Este. The assertive individuality of both Isabellas served them well, and in the case of Gardner, her purpose-built museum, it was not her home, remember, was designed as a pastiche of the Venetian palazzi that she knew from her travels and served as a strong personal statement of her collecting personality. In her case, nothing would be added and nothing would be moved around until very recently. Now a few things are. So the ghost of Isabella follows us around the personal arrangements of textiles and works of art, paintings, idiosyncratic juxtapositions of art from different eras and different national schools. And as a result, a visitor to the Gardner to this day feels enveloped by Isabella's aesthetic sensibility and has to virtually hunt and peck for the extraordinary old masters she acquired during the 1890s and early years of the 20th century, or the spectacular contemporary art that she supported and commissioned for her Spanish courtyard, for example, where you see so brilliantly Sargent's El Jaleo. Staying with women for just a moment, Arabella Huntington, the formidable Arabella, was just 11 years younger than Isabella Stewart Gardner, and she had a less obvious but equally profound influence on Gilded Age private philanthropy and public collections through the sway she held with her two Huntington husbands and her son, Archer. First was Collis, one of the Big Four founders of the Union Pacific Railroad, who commissioned paintings from Bierstadt and bequeathed many of the works he owned to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, with a life interest for his wife and son. Then came nephew Henry, whose will established the glorious Huntington Library art collections and botanical gardens that bear his name in San Marino, California. And lastly, Arabella's son by Collis, who inherited the paintings from Collis and Arabella to eventually donate them in accordance with his father and mother's wishes to the Metropolitan, and who in his own right founded the Hispanic Society of America and built its famed collections of art and literature, including the beautiful Goya Duchess of Alba that you see in miniature down on the lower left. In the case of Henry Clay Frick, we are looking at what I very objectively, of course, regard as the perfect combination of what's mine is yours. The far-sighted institutional benefaction. I really mean it, actually. In his case, the core of the museum was his home, and the core of the collection was assembled by him. But, and it's a very big but, for him, the private collection museum should not be ruled from the grave. And through the generosity of his bequest, he envisioned that his home would be reconfigured to be a successful museum space, and the collection would be augmented by new acquisitions of works of quality. He didn't even spell out quality, but they sort of knew. As a result, the public museum has more than doubled in physical size, and the range of works of art has increased vastly over the narrow range of portraits of famous men and beautiful women and gentle landscapes that Frick himself favored, like these, to include Italian primitives by artists renowned as Duccio and Fra Filippo Lippi, and masterpieces of the French 19th century by Ingres and David. As it happens, Henry Clay Frick's best friend from his youth and throughout his life, a fellow Pittsburghian, they took their first trip to Europe together, was Andrew Mellon. Here they are on their first trip to Europe together, which now at last brings us to Washington and the founding a century after the vain attempts of Gilmore and others of a National Gallery of Art. Like Frick, Mellon favored collecting old master paintings, and like Frick, he had a mind all along to leave his art for the enjoyment of the public. However, Mellon's enlightened view of how to establish a national gallery set his own personal interests aside to open the way for others to participate in forming the gallery's collection. Nowhere is the Mellon name in evidence, though Andrew was responsible for some of the greatest masterpieces entering the gallery, including 3 paintings by Raphael, who was always, throughout the centuries, the most coveted of artists for Gilded Age collectors. Moreover, by setting such a high standard, Mellon paved the way for the father and son collectors Peter and Joseph Widener of Philadelphia and Samuel Kress and his brother Rush to augment the Mellon founding gift with donations of the creme de la creme of their own collections. And eventually other later, this is the Kress now, other later 20th century collectors, beyond Mellon's own children, Paul and Elsa Mellon Bruce, followed suit to make donations from their personal collections to the National Gallery. Chester Dale, John Wilmerding, Richard Meyerhoff, and the much-loved here, these are Chester Dale. You'll see so much more of this tomorrow. And then the much-loved Herb and Dorothy, who as civil servants wanted to pay back the nation with their gift of more than 2,000, I think it's more than 2,000 works of art of late 20th century artists. As I laud Mellon's brilliance in founding our National Gallery, I should mention that before the gallery's founding, other collectors bequeathed their collections to the nation. Charles Lang Freer, being perhaps the most prominent in the early years of the 20th century, donating his outstanding collection of Asian and American art to the Smithsonian in 1906 and providing for the museum that bears his name to open in 1923. And it's perhaps Freer's example that prompted Joseph Hirshhorn to make a similar gesture in the post-war period, donating to the Smithsonian the means to build a museum and an initial gift of 6,000 works of art and further endowment funds for acquisitions after his death. So far, the collectors I've highlighted during this romp through 2 centuries of American collecting and philanthropy have been East Coast collectors. Though both Huntingtons made their fortunes in California, they primarily lived in New York. And as I mentioned earlier, New York certainly was the epicenter of art collecting and philanthropy during the Gilded Age, as Collis Huntington, for example, gave his pictures to the Met. But the generosity of collectors can by no means be confined to one geographical area, and this becomes most obvious of all with the generation of Joseph Hirshhorn, who was born in 1899. J. Paul Getty, born in 1892, and Norton Simon, born in 1907. All of them founded extraordinary museums, and the last 2, of course, are way over to the West Coast in Los Angeles. Getty was a serious collector from the 1930s on. Oops, didn't mean to do that. He had a good command of art history and criticism and wrote a history of 19th century Europe. He also published books on art and his own views of art. He could speak numerous languages, and he clearly saw art collecting and art appreciation as the key to understanding cultures of the past. He wrote, for example, quote, "In learning about ancient Greek and Roman art, one cannot help but also learn about the civilizations and the people who produced the art. This will unquestionably serve to broaden the individual's horizons by increasing his knowledge of past civilizations, greatly aid him in knowing and understanding his own," unquote. Getty was disciplined in his collecting, restricting himself largely but not entirely to Greek and Roman marbles, Renaissance paintings, some Persian carpets, and quite a lot of 18th century French furniture. And he owned 3 of the Elgin marbles and acquired the Lansdowne Heracles. Now, although Getty had exhibited some of his art in his California mansion following that tradition of home visits, in 1968 he decided to house it in a permanent museum. The original Getty Museum, which of course now is the Villa, the Villa in Malibu, was completed in 1974 and reflected the collector's first and foremost passion for antiquities. At one point, my understanding is that Getty was going to underwrite the absolutely impossible undertaking of excavating the actual Villa dei Papyri of Herculaneum, but that soon morphed into the much more practical decision to recreate it in Malibu. On his death in 1976, he left most of his estate to the museum, and later in 1997, as all of you know, the J. Paul Getty Trust opened the Getty Center in Brentwood, which houses not only the collections of non-antiquarian holdings, but it also has expanded to include an extraordinary research library, conservation labs, sculpture garden, and educational facilities. In many ways, Getty's gesture can be summed up in this comment that he made. Quote, "As I learned in my youth, a gift, whether to the public or an individual, is something given of one's own volition and without strings attached. Otherwise, it is no longer a gift, but a business transaction. And if I had wanted to do business with my collection, I would have gone all out and sold it off." So it tells you a lot about what's yours is mine. Now, Norton Simon, by contrast, you have to kind of think he was doing business with his collection because he's known famously for driving extremely hard bargains and for buying and selling and trading around, but he certainly amassed a collection of extraordinary quality. His ruthlessness might perhaps be most in evidence with the museum that he purchased. It was the Pasadena Art Museum when he bought it, and it was a kind of interesting, but not the building that Frank Gehry built for him later, that you see here. And he just sent almost all of the holdings of the Pasadena Art Museum into the basement, even though some of them were quite fine late 20th century works of art. But the quality is exceptional, as you can see in that collage. The last two collectors I will speak of ever so briefly offer to me a fitting conclusion for what's mine is yours, but in rather different ways. Alice Walton, who opened Crystal Bridges in Arkansas not so long ago, aspired to give a community that was starved for great art the vision of a superlative collection of American art. And she consulted with experts and rather selflessly amassed this collection, as usual, to educate people who, in that part of the world, I'm told, many had never set foot in a museum, including the adults. And so this was a special act of philanthropy that related to art collecting. Eli and Edie Broad, on the other hand, started out as collectors out of their own personal passion. They paid on time for some of the early works of art they bought. They didn't buy a Warhol that they felt they couldn't afford when they were young, and then they bought the same Warhol for millions later on. But they have the same kind of selflessness that grew out of amassing this exceptional collection. They keep some of it for themselves, but the vast, vast proportion of their collection functions basically as a lending library and as the shifting installations of the Broad Museum that opened to great fanfare in September of 2015. So they also felt that what is theirs has to be ours too. And with that, I will conclude my remarks this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.